Welcome, everyone. I'm Jen Mattoni. I'm with United Survivors. I'm here with our board member, Chris.
My name is Chris Weiner. I am a board member on United Suicide Survivors International. I'm also a nurse and a suicide attempt and suicide loss survivor.
We are excited for this webinar, Why Suicide is Different, Essential Information for Caregivers and Employers. I'll just tell you a little bit about United Suicide Survivors International. So we've been around since 2016. We are a nonprofit, and we help people turn pain into purpose. And we also work to elevate voices of lived experience. And we do this through leadership, action, and collaboration and advocacy. We're very involved with workplace suicide prevention, which we're going to be talking about. We help, organizations change their culture in terms of workplace suicide prevention and mental health and recovery. And that in part is through our HOPE certification program, which is one of our newer programs. And then we also are very focused on storytelling, and we offer courses and retreats that can help you determine if you're ready to share your lived experience story and how you can share it effectively and safely. And we have a series of men's mental health books called Guts, Grit, and the Grind. And they are stories written by men for men. Then, of course, we also have our webinars like this one. They're always on hot topics in suicide prevention, and we always incorporate voices of lived experience. Well, I'd like to introduce our first speaker now, Dr. Jody Jacobson Fry. Jody is going to also serve as our moderator tonight, in addition to being a panelist. And she is a full professor with tenure at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. She also serves as Associate Dean for Research and is the founder and faculty executive director of the Center for Behavioral Health and Well-Being Research. For almost 20 years, Dr. Fry chaired the School of Social Work's Workplace and Employee Assistance Subspecialization. And for 10 years, she chaired the Financial Social Work Initiative. Dr. Fry's research focuses on adult and emerging adult behavioral health and well-being, with an emphasis on suicide prevention, mental health, substance use, the workplace, and social determinants of health. She's published over 100 articles, books, and book chapters, in addition to presenting research at international conferences and receiving numerous awards for her research and teaching. Dr. Fry co-chairs the Workplace Suicide Prevention and Postvention Committee, actually with our board president, Dr. Sally Spencer Thomas. They are working to disseminate the national guidelines for workplace suicide prevention. And in spring 2023, Dr. Fry was honored to receive 2 awards from her students.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to everybody who's watching. I'm really honored and thrilled that you decided to spend this time with us on this topic. It's something that is really important to all of us on the panel. It's a topic that is rarely talked about in workplaces, but unfortunately continues to be a challenge for so many individual employees and people who are affected and touched by suicide. So I'm really happy and hopeful that this conversation this evening will shed light on this topic and also provide you with strategies and resources and tools that you can use at your workplaces, and you can also share with your loved ones. Really happy to be here with the co-presenters tonight, so I'm going to introduce them. Our next slide is Johanna Louie, who is a licensed clinical social worker and also the co-founder of Suicide is Different, and you're going to get to hear a lot about that organization. Johanna is passionate about caring for caregivers. In her over 10 years of working in suicide prevention, she's served in caregiving roles such as a crisis line manager and a psychotherapist. She's directed clinical programs. And in 2018, she co-founded the Suicide is Different LLC with Daniela Zanich. And to this day, the organization Suicide is Different continues to provide support services for professionals and family caregivers for someone who's thinking about suicide. I've had the pleasure of working with Johanna on the National Committee for Suicide Prevention and Postvention, and she's really helped to be a leader in this area to shed light on this topic and help us all to get more involved in some of the solutions. So thank you for being here, Johanna. And I'm also thrilled to be here tonight with our third speaker, Christelle Joel Tajul. Christelle is a PhD student at the University of Maryland, where I work. I also have the honor of working with him as a graduate student. And before coming to the PhD program, he works with individuals and families providing mental health services. He's certified in dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, contextual DBT, and trauma therapy. He's an expert clinician who's also blending that with his research interests to think about suicide and suicide-related behaviors amongst Latino youth. So Christelle is very interested in the implications of cultural variables in suicide. And part of his research is actually going to be developing culturally tailored interventions for Latinx youth who are experiencing suicide-related behaviors. So very excited to have him here as he's guided by anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and socially just research. And also a graduate from the University of Maryland and will soon be a second graduate. So really happy to have the committee and the panel here with us tonight. So moving into our topic, I just want to start off by introducing some of you may not know about the Workplace Suicide Prevention Program. Jen mentioned that I am very honored to co-lead that with Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas. And this is a group that was launched, the website anyway, the national guidelines for suicide prevention were launched on October 10th in 2019. It was World Mental Health Day. And we'd been working for well over a decade to think about how could we standardize and provide guidance to workplaces and organizations to help them make suicide prevention a health and safety priority at work. So if you haven't had a chance to explore the national guidelines for suicide prevention, I encourage you to go to workplacesuicideprevention.com. A lot of resources, some that you'll find at the end of the slides, are available freely for there, and there's lots of opportunity for you to get involved with us. When you take a look at the guidelines, they are supported through a collaborative partnership with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and United Suicide Survivors International. And we have a very diverse committee sharing a lot of the same values, ensuring that we have many individuals that have lived experience, not only that helped guide the development of the national guidelines, but also help us think about the evolution of those guidelines and the dissemination and implementation. So all of the guidelines are based on these 8 guiding principles. I'm not going to go over them all tonight because we really want to get into our content, but there's some that are really important, I think, with our topic tonight of thinking about caregivers. In particular, thinking about developing culture cultivation and how do we start to change the culture of a workplace to one that is a culture of caring. And then also thinking about empowered connection. How do we link people to care? How do we get conversations to open up so people can even talk about that they might need care? And how do we make sure we connect them with organizations like Johanna's that you're going to hear about? We've designed the guidelines to be very specific, but also many of them easy to implement practices that follow a comprehensive public health model with upstream, midstream, and downstream interventions. And you can see by the rows, the top of the row is the upstream interventions. And when it comes to caregiving, some of the things that I want us to listen for tonight are policy change, leadership. Jen mentioned storytelling, which is really important in workplaces to cultivate that skill. And then in the middle, some of our midstream approaches that I think we'll touch on tonight might include training, whether it be for managers or for other coworkers, but also thinking about peer support and how can we be available to our coworkers. And then, of course, the downstream interventions are just as important. And this has to do with thinking about where do we connect folks for care when they need it? How do we respond to a crisis while supporting dignity? And all in all, working to go back upstream towards prevention and really cultivating that culture of caring. So you're going to see this slide twice. And we think it's important for tonight because we need your help. And this topic, as you're going to hear and learn about, is really under-researched. The voice of people who are in the workplace that are caregiving for someone with suicidal ideations and behaviors is almost unheard in almost all workplaces. And we want to raise that voice. We want to understand what are some of the supports that have been helpful, and also what are things that you wish that your workplace had done or could do in the future. So the University of Maryland, in conjunction with Workplace Suicide Prevention, we have an anonymous online survey, and we would really love to hear from you to think about what are your experiences and how can you help us to share that information in a confidential, again, it's anonymous survey. But this will really help us to provide employers with what they need to be better supports to suicide caregivers. So I'm hoping that this will be one action item that we can all take away tonight, is either to do the survey ourselves, if applicable, or to share it with others. So I'm really delighted now to turn it over to Johanna, who's going to talk about some of how the caregiving is different and what some of the potential resources are for us to think about. So thank you, Johanna.
Hi, everyone. As Jody mentioned earlier, I am a licensed clinical social worker, but prior to becoming a professional in this field, I came into the role of a suicide caregiver when I was in college. That was the first time that I had that experience. And I had a friend who I was very close with, and we shared in the same circles. And everyone was coming to me asking, "You're the person who's the psychology major. You should know what to do about our friend who is experiencing thoughts of suicide." And that was the first time that, even though I was a psychology major, I interned at the school's counseling center, but I didn't really know where to go. And during that time, I really kind of firsthand saw that there was a lot of lack of support. I experienced some of the feelings that we often hear suicide caregivers talk about, talking about fear that something's going to happen to the person that they're caring for, and the lack of support. That was something that I really saw firsthand. And at the time, I sort of piecemeal together supports based on what I knew, the best that I could do, reaching out to colleagues from the counseling center and whatnot. And at that time, I think that really kind of planted the seed in me to get into this type of work, and actually leads me to identifying today, starting off with, who are suicide caregivers, right? We might not even have heard of that term before. And we, in this scenario, are using the term to describe someone who's caring for someone thinking about suicide. So this term, we are thinking about caregiver as someone who is providing support, someone who is making someone's life easier, safer, and more comfortable. We use this term not to pathologize suicide, but because we find that a lot of people with lived experience that we've talked to when doing the research around this program identified themselves as being a friend, being a sibling, being a cousin, whatnot, coworker even. And they didn't recognize that providing support, providing care actually required a lot from them. And we found that helping folks recognize that they're in a caregiver role really helps them understand, like, they have new responsibilities now. There are skills that they can acquire that would be really supportive for them. And then also the time and kind of emotional toll that it can take. So one thing we've seen in a lot of caregiving research is that being able to recognize what you need to know and feeling confident in the role can help you be more successful in providing support. So we use this term because we believe that it's really important for folks to recognize that they are in this role now, and that there's intentional preparation that can really increase their confidence in providing support and lead to more successful relationships being fostered. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of this. So as Jody mentioned earlier, there isn't a ton of research out there around suicide caregiving. So we are going to look at the prevalence of mental health caregiving to hopefully maybe give us a little bit of a picture of how common is this sort of occurring in our country. So according to a survey done by the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, they had estimated around 8.4 million Americans were in the role of providing support for someone who was struggling with their mental health. And AARP found that there was a rise in this as we got into the 2020s of how many caregivers were saying that they were also supporting someone who was struggling with their emotional health or mental health issues. Another kind of statistic that just gives us an idea of how frequent this may be occurring is that there was a poll done in 2020 that where 55% of adults said that they knew someone who was thinking about suicide. So again, knowing someone doesn't mean that they're in that caregiving role, but gives us a glimpse of how often someone may be in the position to be providing care. We might think, there's a lot of conversations around caregiving out there sometimes, and maybe for elderly parents, whatnot, but how is suicide caregiving different, right? In the workplace specifically, there could be a lot of discrimination that's potentially occurring. A lot of folks mention that they feel like they are kind of suffering in silence, in the sense that they don't know how to bring it up to their workplace as, hey, I'm providing support and I need support myself, because they fear about the stigma that comes with mentioning that suicide is part of their life, and providing care to someone who's thinking about suicide is something that they're doing. Also, because of that same stigma, a lot of caregivers find that there's less direction that they have. They find that a lot of times there's less collaboration with medical providers around what support they can give and how they can be part of the care plan. I think that's very similar to the point of role ambiguity. A lot of times people don't know how they can support someone who's thinking about suicide. They might feel like, I don't want to overstep. I don't want to make any assumptions. So that can lead caregivers in those roles feeling like they're unsure about what their steps can be. A lot of times also with suicide caregiving, the period of care is quite long, right? When you look at the trajectory of caregiver, a lot of times it goes from pre-diagnosis up until bereavement. Whereas for suicide caregiving, there's a lot more ups and downs. There are periods that the person that is being cared for, that loved one, may be doing better and the role might be lessened. And there might be times of crisis where they need to be more present. This can really cause an increased strain on the caregiver, sort of not like having to navigate, what does that look like? All of this uncertainty, all of this lack of clarity, where do I stand? What is needed of me at every time? And that's something that could be quite different when it comes to caregiving for someone who's thinking about suicide. So you are joining this webinar today, you might be thinking, I'm a suicide caregiver. How can I help? So with our organization, Suicide is Different, we've developed a kind of 3-step process around how we can help by preparing, learning, and sustaining. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these, and then also provide you with more resources and modules to look through at your own pace outside of this webinar. But the preparing is really around what I mentioned about clarifying the role earlier. We want to recognize what our role is as a caregiver, understand how our beliefs and our biases around suicide may come into play when we're providing care. And then we want to learn about the things that we can do to support someone who's thinking about suicide. How do we have conversations around suicide? How do we support them on an ongoing basis beyond maybe the moment when those thoughts are really intense? And then also, how do we sustain that support, right? We've talked about how a lot of caregivers report feeling worried, feeling fear, and feeling a lot of emotional toll that kind of builds up. So developing a system that allows caregivers to sustain their impact, sustain their ability to continue providing support while caring for themselves is a really big key here as well. So when it comes to preparing, these are some of the questions that we encourage caregivers to think about as they reflect on our personal beliefs and personal experiences. How do our understanding of suicide, how might that come into play when it comes to us having conversations with a loved one about suicide and supporting them? And the idea behind thinking about this is not so that we can change our beliefs, but it's really about, so I know that if I may have very strong feelings about suicide, when I am having a conversation with my loved one who is having a hard time and thinking about suicide, how might I want to suspend some of the feelings that I'm having so that I can be a more appropriate support? I can approach them in a way that's going to feel comfortable for them, right? Thinking about all these questions can help kind of us have more conversations that really foster support rather than not being prepared and not kind of thinking about how our biases and our thoughts might come into play. When we talk about learning about how to support someone with thoughts of suicide, we want to be able to start a conversation about suicide, right? So a lot of times people say like, well, I don't want to assume that that's what they're thinking about. It seems like a really big thing to bring up, or they might think it's kind of out of context. So we always encourage folks, if you are concerned about someone, you want to check in, you can always bring up what you've seen changed in their life that's causing you to be concerned, and bring up that concern. It might sound something like, hey, I haven't seen you in a little bit. I get the sense that you're really feeling down. I really want to hear you out. Right? Showing that you really care about them, connecting that concern to your care and speaking from the place of like, oh, I really want to be here for you. Letting them know that they're not alone in this. You're there to support them. And also that sometimes when folks are feeling stressed, when there's a lot of things building up, people consider suicide. And that's why we want to talk about it. And then asking directly. We always encourage direct conversations around suicide as caregivers to be able to open up a space so that we can have a direct conversation about, hey, what's going on? How can I help you? And I want to make sure that this is the topic at hand, right? We want to align to make sure that I'm not making any assumptions about how you're feeling. So this is kind of a model that we would encourage folks to use when they're starting conversations about suicide. And then that third step, right? Sustaining. We want to, as caregivers, be very aware of how we are doing. So checking in with yourself regularly when you find yourself in that caregiving role, asking yourself if there are areas where you are feeling strained. How are you feeling mentally, physically, and socially, right? Being able to recognize that like, hey, if this is starting to take a toll on my routine, how do I go back to my self-care techniques that I've developed and ways that like I can take care of myself during that time. So being aware and intentional about your wellness is really important. And then also know in the workplace, knowing who can be a support for you, right? And this can be really good to think about ahead of time when maybe you are first recognizing that you're in the role of a caregiver, suicide caregiver, thinking about if I need extra support at work, who can I go to, right? So you might even have a conversation with them ahead of time to let them know that like, hey, I might come to you if I need extra help. Who can I talk to if I'm struggling to manage my time, if I'm finding that I'm a little bit behind on deadlines? How can I communicate that to my manager or whoever you can kind of maybe even delegate some responsibilities to? Being aware of like, what is my workplace's process of taking time off? What would be the process of reducing my hours? What does family leave look like? All of these things are really important to kind of think about ahead of time so that when more support might be needed from you, you can kind of manage, navigate, and reach out to those support networks in your work and develop a plan so that there could be a more seamless transition. If you were needing to, kind of hold off on work and your priority is taking care of a loved one, you're able to kind of navigate that more seamlessly, knowing where the resources are. I know that for this webinar, some folks are joining coming from the workplace perspective, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Before I do so, I know that I went through kind of the techniques that you can do in our model quite quickly. We do have a free toolkit on our website that has over 25 modules that outlines some of the things that we've talked about here and more. So feel free to go to our website. It's suicideisdifferent.org, and you can get access to the toolkit directly from there and review some of the materials in more depth. With that said, for those of you who are joining us as employers, one of the really important things is, as I think mentioned earlier, about what workplace suicide prevention, what we really encourage is to build a community, build awareness around some of these suicide and mental health concerns, right? So being able to spot suicide caregivers is a big one. Some of the things to be aware of, if you find that there are changes in conversation about loved ones in a coworker, that might be a little bit of a sign that like, hey, is something going on there? Maybe a coworker has bragged about their child all the time, kind of talks about like, do you want to see these pictures of my child? And suddenly stop bringing them up. Maybe that's something to kind of think about, like, hey, is there something going on there, right? If someone mentions that there's a lot of issues with a loved one, but they're bringing up really vaguely, that might be something to kind of think about too, right? Like, hey, is there a way that I can show more support to kind of see if this person is someone who needs help at this time? I can show that I'm a open person that they can come to talk if they're feeling overwhelmed. Another thing to kind of spot suicide caregivers is when someone might feel really distracted, kind of always on edge, looking at their phone, really worried. That could be another sign that kind of showcases like someone who is worried about a loved one. So that might be another kind of sign that like, hey, maybe suicide caregiving is part of their journey and something to look out for. So how can employers get involved, right? I think even with that slide right before this, talking about the different signs to look out for amongst your workplace to see if identify someone as a suicide caregiver, increasing understanding of that, providing education and normalizing that, hey, it's okay to talk about. If you're supporting someone who's thinking about suicide, we have these resources for you. We're here to listen. We're here to support you. We can help you manage work, right? Supporting caregivers when they need to step away, right? Recognizing that, if they need to do that, what are the processes? It might look different for everyone, right? We talked about how the trajectory of suicide caregiving is a little bit different. So they might need to customize the accommodations that they need, right? So being able to talk with them about, hey, what do you need now and how can we support that? Having flexible conversations about that. And then the other thing is, a lot of times for family leave, there is very specific documentation and paperwork that is needed. And that might be a little bit more challenging to get from someone who is a mental health or suicide caregiver. So taking that into consideration and being able to think about how you can work around that in your policies. And then the most important one, I think, or one really important one to be aware of what are the appropriate resources that you can direct these caregivers to and promoting them, right? Part of it might be even providing programming in your work that allows folks to kind of get some education around that, know where they can kind of be directed towards. So these are some of the ideas to kind of think through as if you are joining us as an employer and thinking about how you can get involved. With that said, I am going to go ahead and pass it along to Christelle to tell us a little bit more about just some survey information and more about workplace caregivers.
Thank you. My name is Christelle Joe Tajo, and I'm a licensed certified social worker clinical, and I also assist Dr. Fry in conducting suicide research. I am certified in dialectical behavior therapy as well. All right, so I know Joanna touched on this definition, who are unpaid caregiver, and I noticed that on Joanna's slide, the word unpaid, right, was not there, and just wanted to emphasize a bit that was unpaid. So unpaid caregiver are anybody who provide care to individual who experience suicidal thought or engage in suicide attempt with no financial retribution. And I think it's important to highlight this aspect of no financial retribution, because professional care or professional carers receive some financial retribution for caring for this individual. And the reason why I'm highlighting this aspect is because there is a very high degree of correlation between the financial aspect of caring for someone and also the toll that it takes on the caregiver. And on the next slide, we're going to see why this correlation happens. So the caregiver experiences happen in multiple domains, and these 4 domains come from 2 very well popular scale that examine caregiver stress. So we have caregiving issues, which are anything that has to do with, attending to all the needs of the person that the caregiver is caring for, making sure that they're taking the medication, making sure that they are safe, making sure that they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and also family issues, because most of the time, caregiver or member of the family or maybe friends, and they happen to have other family members, so they live within the family system. And the person they care for is not the only member of the family. So they have other family obligation, which again render the task complex and difficult. And there are some financial issues. When unpaid caregiver engage in this role, it comes with a financial toll because they sometimes have to stop working. And I know Joanna earlier was talking about some policy that some jobs have, like family leave acting or not this, but not all unpaid caregiver have access to those means. I worked, for example, with families of immigrants with no documents, for example, meaning that they don't have access to all this legal protection at work. So when a mother is caring for her son and she has to take off, first, she's not going to get paid. And second, she's not even sure or guaranteed to get her job back when she resumes work. So there are a lot of financial stressors and financial implications that come with caring for individual who experience suicidal thoughts and engage in suicide attempt. And then social life issues as well, because we need to understand that there's a disruption of social relationship for anybody who is in this role. Because in my clinical practice, for example, I notice that whenever someone is caring for a person with suicidal thoughts or who engage in suicide attempt, they tend to be disconnected with the rest of the social network, right? Because the care of the person who is hurting at the moment, it's kind of draining them. And we also know that the lack of social interactions is also a good precursor of mental health. Unpaid caregivers have needs. And Jody and Joanna pointed in the beginning that there's not a lot of research in this area, and no research also means sometimes no evidence-based practice to care for unpaid caregiver. But we know they have some needs. So they have personal mental health challenges, as Joanna also pointed out. Sometimes family members have their own mental health challenges or even physical health. And at the same time, they want to actively participate in the care of their loved one. In a systematic review, Lavers and colleagues found that unpaid caregivers were complaining that they were usually excluded from the care of their loved one, especially when the loved one was an adult. So imagine how hurtful, how painful it can be to provide care and be cut from care at the same time. That's very emotionally challenging. And they also indicated that they lack effective education on suicide risk management post-discharge from hospital. You know, Joanna mentioned that suicide caregiving is not a straight line, right? It changes. Sometimes the person is doing well, the person is going back to school or to work, everything is fine, and all of a sudden there is a crisis. So the person who cares or the unpaid caregiver has to constantly readjust and readapt to the role. And that's very difficult. And for that, they need to have effective education on how to manage all those changes and all this transition. We have some clinical recommendations for assisting unpaid caregiver. And I know some attendees mentioned that they were practitioners. So the first thing to do is to try to involve as much as possible caregiver in the care of their loved one. And that means, involving them in all stage of safety planning, you know, um, try to try to show them that they are important because they already assuming this role, without retribution. That's very important. However, be mindful of legal and ethical considerations, especially when it comes to adults. And I remember I was working with a family with a transitional youth who was, I believe at the time, 16 or 17 years old. And once the kid turned 18, the mom had to have authorization from the kid to access or even to be present in the session with the child. And sometimes this is really, really, really painful for families. And also, it's important to assist caregiver, in advocating for time off or new schedule at work. Something we found also is that unpaid caregiver were struggling, right? Because couldn't, they were struggling with, the skill of asking or advocating for maybe a new schedule, maybe for time off. But the problem is that, you know, like I mentioned earlier, if you're working with an immigrant family, right, an immigrant family or undocumented family who in the first place don't have the legal status to work and was working maybe under certain circumstances, it's going to be really hard for them, to go forward and say, okay, I want to take a time off because my son is not doing well and, you know, I want to come back after 2 weeks. They're not guaranteed that they will have their work back, when they resume, when they want to come back. So it's important to assist them in advocating by maybe writing a letter to the employers, for example. That's something that can be done. So, and it's also important to be aware of cultural implication. In some culture, stigma around suicide is very prevalent. So it's important to understand safe messaging and also to be patient with family who sometimes struggle to even disclose episode of suicidality when it happens. So these are things to watch for when working with certain groups and certain families. And also it's important to acknowledge the disruption it creates in the family system. Again, some family are very family oriented, right? Collectivistic society. So it's important that when you provide care to a person who's struggling with suicidal thought or who engaged in suicide attempt, when working with the caregiver, it's important to ask questions. Is there any extended family member you would like to be involved in the treatment plan? Or is there any person in your social network you wish be included in the care of the client? All right, so here we have a brief case example just to illustrate everything we've been talking about. So I was working with Scare. So this is Mary, and this is a pseudonym. It's not a real name. Mary is a full-time employee. However, the demand of caregiving have forced her to reduce her working hours to part-time, which significantly reduced her income. She has to take multiple unpaid leave or absence to attend her son's treatment, manage crisis, and ensure he's not left alone. As a result, Mary's monthly income barely covers essential living expenses, leading to mounting debt. Right. Now, the financial strain and work stress have impacted Mary's relationship with her son. And while she wants to provide the best care for him, the ongoing stress has made it challenging for her to maintain patience and emotional availability. And Mary sometimes feels overwhelmed and resentful, which create tension between her and her son. And this tension in turn exacerbates her son's feeling of guilt and worthlessness, contributing to the cycle of suicidality. Well, this is something in my practice I tended to call the vicious cycle of unpaid caregiving. But so you see how being in the role creates financial stress, and financial stress increase conflict between the caregiver and the client, and all of this can just exacerbate the crisis. And now we feel like, oh, what's going on here? And that's why it's important to do the research that we're doing to understand what are all the elements that coming together affect or impact the ability of unpaid caregiver to provide not just care, but effective care to their loved one. And to have answer to this question, we need to do research. And that was exactly the purpose of the survey Jolie mentioned in the beginning of this webinar. Some highlight about the case that, you know, caregiving is a multifaceted and complex situation. And, it affects the caregiver ability to provide effective care and to support the loved one in the best way possible. And something that is also not mentioned is how caregiving also affect the performance of the caregiver at work. Because if a caregiver experiences some challenges, chances are it will have a ripple effect on the way they perform their duties at work as well. So employers, I think, are kind of, in a position to, I think this is good knowledge for employers to know that, okay, if I want my employee to be the best version of themselves at work, I need to give them all the tools and give them all the resources they need, to be the best employee they can be at work. So this is some sample quotes from the caregiver survey. Again, these are not preliminary results. These are just some sample quotes that we have from the survey, and the survey is still live. Some participant mentioned that this is experience at work when asked what did the workplace or coworker do that made caregiving more difficult. They said they were reminding me of the work that needed to be done with no empathy. Some said they show lack of interest, superficial support, perception of the inability to understand. Some said that uh, colleague or employer were passing judgment, there were lack of trauma-informed statement and data terminology regarding suicide, which again, the importance of safe messaging. And someone else mentioned that they didn't do anything active. What was difficult was my belief that there would be discomfort around the topic, so I avoided it. And that being a caregiver would be a disadvantage in the workplace if they knew it. So we know that people are not even comfortable or people don't feel safe to come forward and just assume that, you know, they are caring for their loved one. So I think this is this is a good a good highlight for employers, right? To really think about how they want to approach these issues in the workplace.
Thank you, Christelle. Thank you, Johanna. And thank you, everybody in the chat. It's been really active, and I'm hoping we're getting to all your questions as we go along, so keep them coming. We wanted to make sure that you had some resources. We know there's a lot of information that's been presented tonight. There was a question about postvention, so the postvention guide from Workplace Suicide Prevention is on there. And for those of you that are in positions with employers and organizations that are, really ready to take some of the next steps, I encourage you to look at the policy implications and maybe consider the HOPE certification. So I told you would see this slide again. So here it is. Please, if you get a chance, go ahead and snap the QR code. If the survey is relevant to you after answering a couple of the questions, please feel free to respond. It's anonymous. We won't know if you do or if you don't. It's really completely up to you. And you can also feel free to share it with other folks that may want to have their voice elevated in this work. And it would really help to contribute to the field to help employers, as you saw from some of the quotes that we're receiving from people. This is what we need to have information. That data is very powerful in the format of the numbers, but also the stories that we read, and to be able to share that lived experience with employers so they can understand how to be more supportive of their employees, so they can bring their whole self to work, they can stay at work, and they can get the support that they need. So if you're feeling moved tonight, I would encourage you to go on the workplacesuicideprevention.com website and take a pledge to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority at your organization or your workplace. No better time than now to get started. And you've actually already done quite a bit by coming here tonight and thinking about some of the resources that you might be able to bring to your work organization.
I missed some of the questions around where suicide is different is available. So a lot of our modules are online. So those can be viewed anywhere where internet access is available. We don't provide any coaching services to caregivers outside of the US, but I know that I see that Jen also mentioned some lists of international resources there as well.
When should folks refer people to 988? That's a great question. 988, so for those of you in the US, replaced our suicide crisis line as an easier number to remember and to have more access to local connected resources as well. I think it's always a good time to think about 988, and as well as for caregivers. A lot of times people think I'm not the person who is struggling as an individual, so I don't want to call and jam up the line or take away resources from someone else. And we've had a lot of conversations with SAMHSA and 988 that they really do welcome those calls. They're well resourced. They're able to respond to the individuals who are in crisis or looking for information, but they're also equally able to be a resource for caregivers. If you have questions, you're not sure what to do or how to have a conversation or how do I bring up a question, I'm concerned about someone with suicide, I think 988 can be a really great resource for individuals who are struggling and also those that care about individuals who might be struggling. So anytime is a good time to bring up 988. I think the more times that we bring up the resources and normalize them, the better off that someone, when they really need it, they're gonna remember about it and they're gonna feel like it's okay to pick up the phone and to call.
A question about bullying in the workplace, if any of the panelists wanted to comment.
Yeah, bullying is complicated in the US. We don't have any required legislation that protects. There's been a lot that's been suggested, but it's, and there's recommended guidelines, but there aren't requirements like we see in some of the other countries. I know in the national guidelines for suicide prevention, again, they're not required. They are recommended guidelines. We do talk in terms of upstream approaches about workplace culture and reducing some of the toxic work environment aspects that are related to suicide. We know from Alison Milner's research and others that bullying and harassment and discrimination at the workplace are related and correlated with suicidal ideation. So I think it's important to think about from a culture perspective, but then also the stigma that's involved in that fear that Johanna talked a lot about, of why people often don't come forward with what they're caring, what the caregiving is about, who they're caring for, is really that they fear that they're going to be bullied, that they're going to be ostracized, and that they could even be punished, as you heard from Christelle, when there aren't support for, in the workplace in terms of Family Medical Leave Act or being able to protect someone's job, with even with unpaid leave. People are in danger of being fired and losing their job for taking time off. And I think that that connected with the potential stigma and being bullied really makes people feel even more isolated and alone and not able to bring themselves to work and definitely not able to have support.
Perry is asking also a very interesting question about can you please speak to change of role? Assume this is role reversal in immigrant and refugee families between the child and parent, how this impacts on both the youth and the parent. Yeah. So this is a very interesting question, the issue of role reversal that we see a lot in immigrant families, where we know that youth tend to adapt quicker to the new culture than parents. And that sometimes, change the power dynamic within the family system, where now if the kid become the person who need to translate whenever they go somewhere, or maybe is more aware of the new culture, that give a certain position to the child. And now Patty wants to know, how does that impact uh, caregiving? So this is something that, again, is cultural, and that's why it's important to be aware of all cultural implications, when working with different families, because that definitely can impact, first of all, if the work between the provider and the client, and also between the client and the caregiver. So some of the recommendations for that is to be immersed well in the culture of the person uh, that you're supporting. Is to be immersed in the culture of the person that you're supporting, to understand what the dynamic means, and how to restructure, like using some elements, for example, structural family therapy, how to restructure the relationship so that the parent, the caregiver, becomes the caregiver and remain the caregiver, and really define the roles of that in family therapy session. And this is why it's important to have caregivers and the person they care for in the same room, having like family session where you have both the caregiver and the client, and then talking to the client and explaining why is it important for the caregiver to, to have a certain role and to have a certain, you know, to have certain duty and responsibility. But it's definitely important to have some cultural lenses in this situation.
Thank you, Christelle. And I think with so many of the topics, we see these other blended topics coming in that, caregiving is widespread, and thinking about what we do in suicide prevention also has a ripple effect in terms of well-being and health and even productivity. So from a workplace perspective, there's a lot of reasons to invest in the suggestions that employers can do to support employees, and also the different strategies shared of how employees can start to think about who at their workplace is in their circle of support. Eventually maybe to even become a champion of hope and to start to change that culture. So there's some questions about high school and middle school curriculum to stop suicide and bullying. The SOS curriculum is one that I see quite a bit that is supported in schools.
I think it's actually applicable to the workplace too, because, for example, my 16-year-old has a job. So she's actually a child working in the workplace. So
I also, on that topic, Chris, definitely before, but even perhaps more during the pandemic, and it's really continued, that a lot of workplace mental health programs are getting so many requests from parents about how to support their children and their children's mental health. And so while they may not be very comfortable talking about suicide specifically, I think, from being in this field for over 20 years, I see a lot of interest from parents looking to their employer and their employer sponsored resources to provide them education and support on what they can do. Perhaps that is, that turning point of seeking more mental health and well-being support from the employer opens a door for support for suicide caregivers. And thank you, Johanna, for adding the Human Power Project. All right. Well, I just want to say thank you to the speakers. I learned from both of them on a regular daily basis, and I'm really honored to be able to present with both of you on this topic and to be able to conduct this research. Thanks to everybody in the audience who joined for spending time with us on this topic. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jen and Chris to close out our webinar.
Yeah, just wanted to remind everybody too that we have just such an awesome and exciting event coming up in Minneapolis. So both on November 18th and November 19th. So United Suicide Survivors has what's called a Lived Experience Collective, and it's a convening that's happening on both those dates.
Just to close out, we want to remind you to check out our website if you haven't before, and we're on all the socials. So please check us out there. Workplace Suicide Prevention is also on the socials and has its own YouTube channel. So lots of stuff to check out. Again, thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who joined us.